Community College, where she instructs adult basic and secondary education classes in English language arts and social studies, preparing students to pass high school equivalency exams and transfer to college and career pathways. With a background as a K-12 teacher and professional development provider, she has applied the approach of scaffolding and student engagement in addressing adults' educational needs at the Student Success Center at Glendale Community College, where she teaches. So Karen, thank you very much for being here, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Marion. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm so happy to see all of you here today. See might be a strong word. But anyway, great to have you as part of this webinar. This is my first webinar. I have done professional development when I was working in K-12. My writing background started then. I was interested in how to help K-12 students write better, more effectively, and engage in writing more. And I began teaching professional development on that starting in like 1995. And that segued into my work with helping GED and HiSET preparation students. And in that process, we really had to take a look at what was asked of us as the GED changed to align more with the Common Core. So let me ask you just quickly, who here is thinking also about the changes to the GED since 2014 and how that has radically changed how our students are to perform on the, on the essay exam? Does anybody want to share something that they noticed in the demands and the change in demands? So I'll just enter and say that I noticed that, of course, it changed to asking our students to do reading as part of it, and they were asked to do to read arguments and rhetoric, and then to analyze that rhetoric, and then to respond to that rhetoric. So I'm going to switch to the next slide. Here we go. So here we are on the second slide. And in this slide, we're talking about all the things that we now have to ask our students to be prepared to do in order to do well on the test. So I have the statement at the top that effective writers are effective readers and speakers. So if you'd like, you can use your icon at the top to raise your hand or to say agree or disagree with that top statement. Do you agree or do you disagree? So go ahead and everybody can fill that in. All right, I'm seeing a few people, Deborah, Matthew, Maureen, Susan, Tracy, Tanush. Yeah, so I'm seeing quite a few people agreeing. I haven't seen a disagree. Oh, I see a disagree. So Holly, would you like to share with us what you think?
I think Holly just stepped
Oh,
away.
step away. Sorry, there's a step away. My mistake. Okay, so right. So as we see, go ahead. As we see, in order to write effectively for the GED or the HiSET exam, our students really need to be able to understand what they're reading in a deeper way than just simple comprehension. And throughout this webinar, we're going to look at these parts of what they're asked to do. So the first part being they're asked to really identify what's in an essay. And that may be a hard thing for our students in the beginning. I see most of you are working on GED and HiSET preparation. So I think you have all been familiar with that. And then the next piece is really understanding the analysis. So how do you break down all the parts and put it back together to say whether or not you have a well-supported argument or a strong argument. And that is something that takes some time to build. And then they have to be able to communicate about that analysis. So what I find is it's great to start with communicating that verbally. And so then when they get to the time to write, they'll need to understand what the prompt is. They need to be able to plan how to write and organize their essay, then actually have time to draft that essay and really be able to deal with the timed aspect, the fact that all of this needs to be done within 45 minutes. So we have a tall order to get our students all the way to that goal of being able to do all these things within a 45-minute time span. My background in K-12 really leads me to, let me see, go to the next slide. There it is. Really leads me to thinking about scaffolding. So we are all trying to bring our students to this level of competency, and they need a lot of support. And in that support, we need to think about how can we slowly give them the support they need, and then slowly take away some of that support so they can begin to build competency on their own. So I think I'm going to assume that most of you have already looked at the test and analyzed what it needs to have, but you may have certain, like certain obstacles or certain issues that your students are having. So the first thing is really looking at the test. So we use the GED and HiSET in our center. Some places are also using the task. And some of you, although I didn't see anybody listed, but some of you may be preparing them for another test. And that's something I'm not sure that I saw anybody doing, but some of you may be. So by looking at the source material and the passages, figuring out, what are we going to need to have them analyze? What kinds of essays are they going to be reading? Really analyzing our scoring rubrics, looking at prompts and helping our students break down and unpack a prompt. And in addition, having us look at sample essays. So these are all things that you can find in your publisher's materials. And that can be really helpful in your course design. So really starting with what the test is and then working your way backwards can help you with the course design. Okay, let me just. Okay, great. So the first thing I'd like to talk about today is finding text source material. And the first thing I need to do with my students, and I'm going to assume that you do too with your students, is approach the reading part of this. We used to really break out our literature and our essay class, and we still do teach literature for the reading skills for the reading test, but the reading that's needed for the GED and HiSET test essay is very specifically rhetorical essays, right? So we need to read about arguments. So finding interesting materials is the first start. I really find that when students have more interesting and varied materials that they can relate to, they engage more with the text. One of the positives benefits of having adult students is that they have life experience to bring to the table. And I think if we can draw on that, it can be very helpful for them to know that they have this tool that they can use, that they bring something to the table when they come to read, and that can help build their confidence. So some of the materials that you could find, of course, are in the GED and HiSET publishers materials. They are good examples. They're similar to what they might see on the test, so they're very useful. They're not always very interesting, so I've had some mixed success with them. So I have looked for other sources. So as we read, we're reading different kinds of rhetorical arguments. So one of the things I've done is gone to like the LA Times and other newspapers and look for opinion or editorials. And also the letters to the editor in return. So one thing you can do is find an opinion piece and then at the end, wait 2 or 3 days and start collecting some of the letters to the editor for some of the counter arguments. I also, and if you're part of a community college, and I'm not sure part of a K-12, but we have access through our library to some of the databases online. And there's two that I really like. Opposing Viewpoints in Context is one, and CQ Researcher, and both of those offer pro and con articles. So they have controversial issues and they give you, well-written pros and cons on those issues. And so they have a lot of documentation, a lot of statistics and research. So it's great for helping students learn how to pull out the evidence. So you can see on the side here, I have an example of the GED publishers material. But I wanted to ask you now, take a moment and ask you about the feedback that you have on the sources that I just talked about. Have you used any of those sources? Have you used the GED or HiSET publishers source material? Have you used some of the databases, or do you find other sources? So please share on both questions, both what feedback you have about the sources and if you've used them and how they've worked for you. And also maybe if you can share with us another source of material that you have found that we could all benefit from learning about. So I'll look forward to seeing your responses.
I'm just going to move back to the slide that lists the sources so they can remember what they're commenting about in the first box. So everyone, if you have thoughts about the comments that Karen talked about, type in the first box, new box on the top. And if you have suggestions for other sources that you use for writing prompts, please put them in the box next to it.
Okay, I'm starting to see some responses. So Deborah mentioned that she uses primary source materials. Deborah, I'd love you to elaborate on that and share with us if you have some examples of what kinds of primary sources that you find helpful. I know I also teach social studies and there's great material in speeches. So some famous speeches often offer us great rhetorical devices and also some speeches can give us faulty reasoning. So it's great for that. Oh, Janet says, I've heard good things about News ELA, but I haven't used it yet. One of my coworkers also mentioned that she uses News ELA, so I'm going to actually jot that down. And I look forward to checking it out myself. And ReadWorks. So ReadWorks, yes, another coworker just mentioned ReadWorks, and that has some questions associated with it as well, she mentioned. Okay, you haven't used the sources. Susan, having access to well-written pro and con articles sounds excellent. Yes, that really is helpful. Sometimes if you find an op-ed that has either a pro or a con, searching online for the opposite opinion and position can help. So Maureen asked about samples of well-written responses. They have both the HiSET and GED have published responses that look like each score on the rubric. So if you go for the GED, you can look up on the GED testing service and also on ETS, and they actually publish those responses for you, so you can use those. Also, some of the publisher materials may do that as well in their like responses, in their like answer key part of it. So, Tanush, you mentioned that you're just getting ready to offer the GED and HiSET program at your school. So this hopefully will help you know how to plan and get started on your program. Great. I hope we're of assistance to you today. Okay, great. Oh, getting the pro version of News ELA. Okay, so in that pro version, is that a paid version? That's a question I'd have. Oh, Deborah, thank you for clarifying. You offer things like the Bill of Rights and other historical documents. Yes, terrific. There originally was a timed essay for the social studies GED, and it has been removed from the GED. But working with historical documents can be very valuable because it exposes them to more vocabulary and different structures of arguments. Okay, it looks like we're done responding. Thank you for sharing. I really appreciate everybody's participation. Okay, I'm going to move to the next slide. Okay, in this slide we talk about identifying the parts of an essay. So, since we're all talking about the GED or essay, and please let me know if you do something different, because it seemed like from what I was reading earlier that everybody was focusing on that set of tests. So please respond in the general chat if you teach a different essay exam than this one, but we're all talking about in the HiSET and the GED how to break down an argument and know whether an argument's a good argument or not a good argument. But many of my students aren't familiar with the parts of an argument and the vocabulary surrounding how we talk about the parts of an argument. So there are various words used, and you can use different ones. Our students are often familiar with the idea of a main idea. So a great way to begin is talking about the main idea of an argument is sometimes called the main argument, or a central claim. It can also be called a position. And anyone who has another word for it, feel free to put that up in our chat. Then we talk about reasons or supporting claims. And a main argument may be broken down and supported by 1, 2, 3, or more premises or reasons. These are supporting claims that back up or support that main claim. And then we need to ask our students to look for evidence. So separating out the difference between what is a piece of evidence and what is a reason is helpful. So I'd love anyone to share how they share that with their students. So if you can chat about that, that would be great. One way I have my students do it, first we practice finding it, and then we practice doing it. It's like we make a class example of those things. So we make up an argument, and then we split into groups to come up with reasons to support that argument. And then we kind of create pieces of evidence. The second thing our students really need to understand is what kinds of evidence are out there. So a lesson on the kinds of evidence, the types of evidence. So talking about research, statistics, expert opinion, and that the stronger pieces of evidence versus somewhat less generalizable pieces of evidence like personal experience or an anecdote or personal observation. So we look at all the different types of evidence that you might find. Okay, and then the second thing, another thing we're looking for is if the author includes an acknowledgement of the counter argument. Do they acknowledge what the other side says? And if so, do they refute that reason? Do they give a response to why that counter argument is wrong? or not applicable or not relevant? And do they give any evidence to explain, to support why that's wrong? So helping them see that structure and finding lots of examples. So finding a good piece of argument, a good material to work with can really help you in pulling out all these different pieces. Okay, so I'm looking for chat. I'm not seeing any chat on that. So if anyone has anything to share about how they help their students find the difference between reasons and evidence, I'd love to hear from you. Anybody? Okay, I'm going to advance to the next slide. Okay, so this is an example from the GED testing service of, this is what they put up as their sample essay that any student or teacher can go to on their website and see as a sample. That's why I chose this one, because it's accessible to the public. And this gives your students a nice view of exactly how their GED will look if they go to take it online. This is how the page would look. So that's kind of nice to give them at least one example of that. So students will need to have a variety of text to follow the format that's expected of them. So this one is, for example, very standard. It is main claim, reason, evidence, reason, evidence. So it's very standard formatting. So it's great to start with something that's very standard and easy to find. So this is one of the first ones I often do, or one similar to this, and having students work together. I find this is where I really build in a little bit of the reading apprenticeship approach. Raise your hand if you're familiar with the little icon at the top, the raise hand one. Raise your hand if you're familiar with the idea of reading apprenticeship. Just to see if I refer to that, if I need to explain further. I see there's Alice has been familiar with it. And so the idea, I'll just do a quick explanation. The idea of a reading apprenticeship is an approach that engages the student learner as the director of their education so that they interact with text from day one. And instead of us being the expert as the teacher and expecting students to simply have us give them the answers, they're finding the answers and we're probing them to push them further into it to figure out their own process with using their reading to understand and analyze. So in this portion of it, what you would do, you'd start out by modeling. So I might spend an early class with an essay like this, and we'd go through together, and I would model out loud. I would think aloud, is what they call it in the reading apprenticeship approach, but I would think aloud with my students and say what I'm thinking. So I'm showing them as a model of how to read analytically, what to do. So I would write notes and annotate while saying aloud why I'm making those annotations. So I would say, oh, well, I'm reading ahead here and I'm seeing a lot of history about daylight savings time. So this is probably an introduction. And then I would go forward and sort of say, oh, and now I see that there's a main claim here. This author is taking a position that daylight savings time is beneficial. Okay, I wonder what reasons that they give. Let me read ahead and see if I find any reasons. So after I annotate and do that out loud, our next portion, maybe of the same source material, I would have students do that perhaps in groups. So then they can practice and talk about it out loud without a written expectation. Maybe they will be annotating along with it, but they're going to be talking about it. And then have them come back to the group and tell what their group decided. So whether their group, what their group found and where they got stuck, why they decided to choose various reasons and various pieces of evidence. So I'm going to move to the next slide that talks a little bit more about all that. So in annotating, sometimes our students don't know what to put down. So they need to maybe think about it. What is it about the text? What is this text about? So understanding the difference between topic and position is important. So what is the main claim and what is the topic that's being discussed? Also, where is it? Finding the page numbers so they can do it later. So even if they note it, they can underline it or highlight it and write on the side, but they could write like paragraph 2, page 1, so they know that they can do it later. And who says it? So is this an idea of the writer or the author, or is this an idea that's being cited by someone else? And finally, so what? So what's important here? Like, this is important because this is a piece of research and it probably backs up this idea, and I might make an arrow to show them where it backs up a certain idea. I also have students engage in finding golden lines, like let's all find a powerful piece of evidence that you think helps prove the point. Let's see if someone has a good reason here, a relevant reason, or let's see if someone has something that's not logical. Does anything here in this paragraph not make sense to you? And having them talk about those kind of things with their group first and then back to the class is really helpful. The other part that I want to talk about with reading apprenticeship that I've really been changing the way I teach this class using those ideas is that when students get stuck, what do? When students just look at you with blank faces because they didn't know what to do, what do we do? So in this approach, we do ask the students to go back and we ask probing questions until they can get to it. So we go back a few steps, possibly to the main claim, and then ask if they can find anything that maybe they got stuck on, where they stopped understanding. And then try to have them work backwards until they can find the part that you're looking for them to do and to share about. So do you have any other, what kind of golden lines do you think you'd want your students to identify? Like, what would you ask your students to look for? So if anyone wants to share that, please use the general chat. If there's something you'd have your students look for to annotate or take notes on or find and share with a group. Okay, so I'm going to move to the next one, but still please feel free to share with us. Okay, and we talked earlier about scaffolding, and I think most of us have this idea that we offer support for our students. And many of our students didn't achieve a high school diploma because they may be new to this country. They may be have a degree in another country, but they may not have a diploma here in the US. We also have students who, for whatever reason, maybe don't have had a lot of holes in their education. They don't have a great experience in the past. They may not have the soft skills related to, writing and reading. So sometimes that's our job, is to fill in some of those soft skills. So by offering things like graphic organizers, we can give them a chance to sort of learn how to organize the ideas of what they're pulling out from their reading. So I use this, you can find various, this is copyrighted, so I'm not offering it as a handout, but you can find these online. And there's various sources online. And you can create your own as well. And that helps students sort of start to see how to plan it out. And I give these out for the first few times we go through, and then I stop giving it, because then I'm expecting my students, I show my students even how I might set up a paper to take these notes on my own. And then I don't even tell them to do it. And I want them to use what's going to work for them and decide what they really need. So we talked a little bit about modeling. So we do a lot of modeling, and that's me talking out loud about what we're doing. And doing it in front of them and telling what I'm thinking. So this is using a lot of the metacognition ideas, like here's how I think about this process out loud. So it sort of demystifies the process of analyzing, which seems like this big word, but really it's just breaking it down into its parts, looking at those parts, and putting it back together to ask, are these parts enough to build together a good argument? So note taking is important. So if we go from annotating to note taking, and this is a structure you can use to do that. And then we also talk about analysis talk. So this is the next part. There, we need to talk about how can we tell whether these reasons are good reasons or bad reasons. Are they strong reasoning, or are they logical, or is it faulty reasoning? And we look at the evidence, and I'll get into what we're going to talk about that next. So let me see how we're doing on time. Okay, great. We're perfectly on time. Okay, so analyzing arguments and evidence. With my students, we look at these two different parts. First, we spend some time looking just at the arguments, and then we look at what makes good, valid evidence. So we've broken down by looking at all the materials into strong arguments being logical, accurate, specific, and relevant. So we talk about what does logical mean, and we talk about logical arguments, but that leads us to talking about faulty logic. So we spend a little time looking at faulty logic and what are examples of fallacies, and identifying fallacies, and then looking at what makes a logical argument. So looking at the relevance, does it directly support the claim? And is it specific? Does it give an actual reason as opposed to just saying something is generally good or generally bad? And then when we look at evidence, we break down, and I break it down into these 3 A's. They're maybe not the best words, but they're great because the students can remember the 3 A's. And that just really is helpful to have that. And they begin, because we use this graphic throughout the semester, that they begin to really identify those 3 A's. Like they just know when we're talking about analyzing evidence, it's the 3 A's, and they will just have it in the back of their head to ask themselves those 3 questions. So are we getting something from a reliable source? Is it unbiased? We might also ask, is it up to date? Is the source even named? And is it appropriate? So is this relevant, directly supporting the claim? And we try to find examples of it and examples of it not being appropriate or relevant. So then they can look at what it looks like when it's right and what it looks like when it's wrong. And then we also ask about adequate. Is there really enough evidence to support the claim? So for example, maybe we only have like a personal experience as the evidence to back up an argument. And is that sufficient? Can that be generalized to the greater population? So now I'd like to ask you about what critical thinking skills are required for your students. What will your students need to employ? And what scaffolding helps your students engage with the text or prepare for the essay? So there's 2 questions here. If you have any further critical thinking skills that you'd like to share that you're working on with your students, please put those in the one chat box. And then the second chat box, tell us what other scaffolding, what other either techniques or structures do you give your students to help them engage with the text or to help them organize their ideas or collect data or collect passages, collect information, or to put in for their analysis. So any kind of scaffolding, any kind of extra support you offer your students. So I'll give you guys a minute to add those responses. So I think people are thinking. That's great. So some things you may want to add in. Do you use some kind of graphic organizer, and what kind helps your students? Do you offer some activities that help your students? Oh, I see here, Deborah says that she's using templates such as T-charts that are helpful. So that could be a great way. So Deborah, can I ask like, oh, in brainstorming? Yes. So I find when in our old GED, the pre-2014, before we were Common Core aligned, we did a lot more brainstorming because we were thinking of our own ideas to support our own persuasive essay about our personal opinion on a topic. But now students are asked to respond to arguments, pro and con. And in the high set, they are asked to give their opinion. So some brainstorming for that would be very helpful. But in the GED, they're only asked to respond to which argument is stronger or better supported. So I use a little less, but I'd love to hear what kind of brainstorming might be helpful in that case. And um, yeah, T-charts using paragraph frames. Excellent, Alice. Thank you. Yes, we use those. We're going to talk about that later in the webinar. I'm seeing here some graphics, but I'm also going to ask what kind of engagement techniques. Sometimes this class, like this webinar, can be a lot of one person talking and the students just kind of either reading or reading aloud, and we can get into that funk or that little bit of a groove where we find that it's just read aloud and then class discussion or teacher talking at the class. And I find that I'm working on not having that happen. So I find different ways to have my students work in groups or with pairs. Think, pair, share is one that we can use. And I was wondering from you what kind of engagement techniques. How do you get the students to work with the text? Great, I see a few people are getting their ideas down. Something that we've talked about in this reading apprenticeship approach that our college is beginning to adopt throughout the curriculum, not just actually the credit classes as well, and professors from all different um, areas are using to have students engage with text more meaningfully. Is being okay a little bit with the silence to give people time to think. So I'm going to be quiet for just a moment and let you do that. Deborah says, for example, we just used a prompt about the Cold War. And as an introduction to the topic, we brainstormed Cold War in general to have a starting point and then began to organize the information we came up with. Great. So that sounds great. And also, yes, helping determine what do we already know and what are we looking to find out more. Oh, Janet mentions that our students are self-paced, working on a computer program on their own, so they don't have much time for direct instruction, but hoping to start more of that in the future. Great. So that is something I'm thinking about as well. We're looking at offering in the future, possibly offering a distance education option. So perhaps thinking about adding some tools online, maybe using an online LMS or learning management system. If your school has one, our school uses Canvas, that you can put places for them to engage with each other and ways for them to engage with the text. For example, some videos and then some assignments. Oh, Patty's mentioning that they read articles on civil rights and human rights. That's great. It's a great issue and it's a enduring issue, so that is great. And brought in an attorney to talk about rights. So they followed with writing essays on the top 3 rights that were most important to them and why. Terrific, right? So that's great. And our students, many of our students will be going on to write for various different prompts in the future. But in the meantime, I like to think about ways to have them work with the text that they have. So I think having an attorney come talk to them is great because that gives them the more personal touch and they get personal experience with it. Okay, so I think that's the end of the discussion there. So hopefully we'll find ways to engage with our students. Keeping our students engaging in group work and talking to each other, even when you do a class discussion, is somewhat critical because they need to learn to speak about their analysis and explain why something seems logical or faulty reasoning, or why a piece of evidence seems right to them or not right, so they can build up the vocabulary related to that. So the next step is planning for the essay writing. So looking at your plan, like how do you help your students get organized and to write an organized essay? So we're often teaching about the 5-paragraph essay method, and they're pretty familiar with that when they come to me. I know in the basic skills level, they really cover what should a paragraph have and how do all these paragraphs work together. So where I go is I go to the next step and look at the rubrics. And based on the rubrics and what they're looking for, I can help them plan out what should be in each of those paragraphs. That those paragraphs should include very specific structures. More advanced students can play with this, but I think it's very helpful scaffolding to students to have a start with, it's not a mystery. It's almost like algebra, and there's a bit of a formula and you can plug it in. And as you get more competent, you can begin to play with this. And that's when we read throughout the semester, we begin to read different structures of rhetoric, like speeches and other historical documents that may take the rhetoric but do it in a different structure, and that's a more advanced level. But knowing that they can fill in very specific pieces of information that's still asking them to do thinking and pulling and explaining, but then they know what kinds of information to put in different parts. So I've made this rubric. Based on the rubric, I've made this outline for my students, and this is available in the handouts below, which you can download and will also be available on the AABG website. Okay. So just going to go back one bit here. In this outline, one step that we do with the sort of student engagement is once they've taken notes on graphic organizers, the next part is to start to take notes based on what they've read and discussed in a group or with partners or as a class. They can take notes right on this outline. So they get the idea of the kinds of things that they're going to be putting in. So for example, where it says under body paragraph, introduce the evidence, they can put in like paragraph 2, and then the first word of the line, so they can start to plan out their essay as they go. So this is a great tool to use for planning and note taking. Okay, so as my students start to write more than just annotating notes, we have to do this step by step. Raise your hand if your students have some fear of writing. So you can use the little icon in the chat. Yeah, I'm sorry, the little icon at the top where it says, has the little guy with their hand raising up. So if you find that your students have some fears about reading, let us know. I see Deborah, Maureen, Alice. I know not only do my students have fear of writing, I have fear of writing. And I've been doing it for a long time, right? So it's one of those things, it can be really make you feel vulnerable to put your ideas down on paper. And if you don't feel like you're very strong in this area yet, you may feel shy or embarrassed or hesitant to put your ideas down on paper. So Alice mentioned using writing frames, and I just want to encourage you to consider that. So let's start with that. It is a little bit of a more non-threatening way to begin writing. So actually, even before we do a writing frame, we start even earlier. So we go back and we start with, as we talk about finding a piece of evidence and we find it and we highlight it and we annotate it, we can end that class with writing a sentence about the piece of evidence. This piece of evidence supports the main claim, and then learning how to quote and cite a piece of evidence. So we can practice that, or we can talk about the reasons. One reason the author gives for to support his position is, and answer that. So we can even start with one sentence at a time and then build up. So a writing frame like this helps them look at a body paragraph and how to, begin filling in the pieces of information in a little more non-threatening sort of way. And they can use their notes from the graphic organizers or from their outline. And then from here, they can share with a neighbor. And then we can give our, in the think, pair, share idea, where you work on it alone, share with a neighbor, share with a partner, and then you can give the partner one question to ask. Is the quote relevant to the, to the topic sentence? Or is the explanation clear? Is the reasoning why it's invalid clear? Or could you suggest a word change to your partner? And giving them one task to do to give feedback. So if we give them a way to give feedback respectfully and helpfully, they'll learn how to be better, help each other. And it also creates a bit of a class culture. So you would like your students to, you start the class by really having your students get to know each other and begin working together and have some class routines that make it feel safe in the environment, so that they know that we're all here to help each other. And you may see that then move towards students helping each other outside of class. So we have a lab that students can work in to do their independent work, and we do see our students beginning to work together at times. So creating a class model. Okay, so one thing you can do that I find useful is I have my students, we might start with a frame, and then I'll have them report back to, after they meet with their partner, to the whole class. That's the share part of the think, pair, share. And from the whole class, when I take from each group, I'll fill in the lines, and we'll have a model together that we've created that is a model of a sample of a acceptable paragraph. So that can be very helpful for them. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to go back to the writing prompt in a little bit, but I'm going to ask you to do a little activity with me. And here's a little, one of the GED, actually I think the GED may offer this one, but one of the source materials that I use asks the prompt, analyze the arguments in favor of and opposed to hosting the Olympics in your city. Write an essay in which you explain which argument is better supported by sound reasoning and evidence. Well, the students would have a pro argument and a con argument to work with. But what I'd like you to do is think about how to help your students form a thesis statement, which is going to be their response to the prompt. And see if you can create a writing frame to answer this prompt with a thesis statement and share your ideas in the chat box that's going to be provided. I'll give you some time to start writing that. So a frame for just a thesis statement is what I'm asking you to do. Okay, I'm wondering if
Okay, I'll give you guys a new box to write your thesis sentence frame in.
thank you, Marian.
Maybe we need an example of what you mean, Karen.
Sure, I think I don't see anyone typing. So what I have my students do, like the writing frame on the past one was for a paragraph, but maybe for this, you take your question and turn it around into a statement. And the statement will either be, I actually can't see that anymore.
Mm-mm.
Okay, so I can't see the thing anymore. Thank you. Okay, so if we're asked to write an essay to explain which argument is better supported, we might say the argument in favor of or the argument opposed to blank is better supported, and either by, and then maybe we leave open. So you might write a thesis and then take out some of the words that your students could fill in. So they begin to understand how we turn that prompt into an answer.
I see Janet typing, so we'll wait a second for her to finish her writing
Great.
prompt. We only have about 2 more minutes,
I
though.
see that. Yes. So we are going to move forward pretty soon. So actually, can we leave that chat box up and move on while people are typing?
Janet, we're gonna,
Okay.
yes, you can move on. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you. All right. So just as some of you may be writing, and I appreciate your input. Um, Another way to do it is to use sentence starters. So as you try to build their own independence in writing, giving them some tools about how to start those sentences is another way. And then also we can build vocabulary lists. So for example, my students might find themselves saying the author used a credible source or provided a credible source. So then we think, okay, we've used credible a few times. They start noticing, oh, I used credible 3 times. So we start talking about other words we could use, reliable, trustworthy, and we start to build these lists together. And giving them various words that they can use can be very helpful. Um, Unbiased or impartial. So trying to give them some of those words. And I have a list of sentence starters that my students and I actually came up with together, and that'll be available in the timed writing. You can see in the handouts below. And it builds fluency with the academic language. And if you use the language repetitively and a lot, they begin to be more familiar with it. So when test day comes around, hopefully they are ready. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is like building up to the whole essay. Can be kind of scary when they're asked to write the whole essay from beginning to end. So after using sentence starters, and I might have my students write one paragraph at a time. So we might do the discussion part together and then have them write one body paragraph and then get some feedback together on that and then do another body paragraph. and eventually building up to giving them time toward the end of the semester with timed essay writing. But first having them put the whole thing together, knowing that they can break it down. And then giving them those test simulations where we give them the time. I don't start with 45 minutes, but I'll give them like an hour and 15 minutes and then begin to lessen the time toward the very end of the semester as we're doing some test prep. So, because it's actually quite frightening to do the 45 minutes. Your positive and negative feedback to your students should be directly related, by the way, to the rubrics that you have. So showing them, talking to them about their organization, about their argument, and about their structure, their conventions. And that's going to be very helpful. It also teaches students how to give feedback to each other. So you can give them something very specific on the rubric to look for in each other's essays, if you allow that. But be really, really careful with peer revision because you have to have a trusting and good working relationship before they're ready to do that. I wouldn't start peer review until they're a little more comfortable with their writing. Okay, so showing them how they're using items effectively on the rubric is also very helpful. So I like to sandwich it with showing them 2 or 3 things that they are using effectively out of the rubric, and then one thing that they can add. Students can only add so much new knowledge or new critique at a time. So kind of focusing on one item to work on improvement is a great way to have them begin to be able to integrate that new knowledge. And before we go, I want to say Janet had hers up here, and the argument in favor of hosting the Olympics in our city is well supported by blank, because blank in paragraph blank. Great. So you're giving them a chance to say why and to say where and which side that they take. Terrific. That's great. And it gives students the idea about how we can turn that prompt into a thesis statement. So don't forget to practice with your students a lot. So toward the beginning of the semester, it's a lot of discussion, a lot of group work and reading. But toward the end of the semester, it's a lot of writing. And this might mean writing a new essay in class every day. And then at the very end, I'm sending them home to write. But I really don't have them do much writing at home until the very end of the semester because I find they just don't feel comfortable yet. And then they just don't do it very often. So I hate to build a whole lesson around a home writing assignment and then only 2 or 3 students have it actually completed. So I think they feel with more support from having a teacher there, they are more willing to write. And I sort of have the structure of the class, and that's what we're doing. And we're working through it in piece by piece that they know that that's what's going to happen. And our last slide here, I think we're out of time. So I just want to say thank you. And the handouts are below.
Right. So thank you so much, Karen. That was a lot of good information. Thank you, everyone who participated. It's good to have you here. When we close the meeting, you will be taken to an evaluation form, and please fill out that evaluation. We value your feedback. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Marion. Thank you, everybody.